Teamwork is dream work, or is it? Today we're going to talk about what goes into a successful cookbook collaboration. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and I'm here with Molly Stevens. Hey, Molly.
Hi, Kate.
So, Molly, we know that not all cookbooks are solo projects. There's lots of different ways to work on books, and sometimes you can be a writer and you can work with a chef, or sometimes you can be a writer and work with another writer, or a photographer working with another photographer, or maybe couples sometimes even write books together.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking cookbook collaborations. Tell me a little bit about one of the collaborations that you've been involved with.
There are so many different ways. I mean, we say every book takes a team, but we're talking about, writing the book or maybe writing and photographing the book. But I think my biggest collaboration was One Potato, Two Potato, which I did with a friend. It became a friend in the course of the project. Wasn't a friend when we started, but Roy Finnemore and I did that book together. And it was definitely a with. We were similar, both food writers, but it was his project and I was. So there's the with, there's the and, there's the ghostwriting. Are you in the same city? Are you not? I mean, all these different things. Are you friends? Kate, do you know how many you've done?
That's a good question. 10? I don't know. Something like that. I'd have to go back and look.
And your name comes up. If people are looking for a co-author, Kate Leahy is someone who I'm sure is on the top of a lot of lists out there.
And my name's been an and Kate Leahy. It's been a with Kate Leahy. And just for people who have never heard that there's a difference, if you look at a cookbook and there's another name on the cover or on the title page, the and the with, there's slight differences, but that's something that you actually negotiate in your contract.
Right.
That's something that an agent would help sort out. But I've never ghostwrited completely, though. That would be interesting. I've heard that there's probably more money to be made in that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And sometimes you can find the ghostwriters in the acknowledgments, but sometimes they're truly ghosts. You don't know who did it. So
yeah. Did you like the process?
I loved the process. Yeah, I really do enjoy it. I think there's a certain, there's a lot of creativity in it. I think there's a lot of efficiency for me anyway in it because, it's not just you out there.
Good point.
It's also, we've talked about this sort of off record, but there's also a lot of challenges. It can be frustrating because you're not the one driving the bus.
Right. So not all collaborations are fun.
Right.
But today we're actually fortunate that we're going to talk to an author and a co-author on a collaboration that I really feel was the right match. These two just seem to have a really good mind meld. And it'll be interesting to sort of just learn more about their process. To introduce the book a little bit more, it's called Scandinavian From Scratch, and it is the love letter to the baking of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It focuses on Scandinavia and the baked goods that come from Scandinavia, and a lot of it was inspired by the author Nichole Accettola cafe in San Francisco called Canteen. So Nichole, she worked for years in fine dining. So she's not like sometimes you think of a baking book, oh, this person must have been baking their whole lives. Well, she's been cooking her whole life. After Boston, she moved to Denmark and she stayed there for 15 years, started a family there. And then when her family decided to move to San Francisco, that's when she started learning how to make Danish rye bread in San Francisco because they all missed it so much. And she started selling it at farmers markets. And that's where the genesis of her restaurant Canteen came to be. Pretty incredible story there, Molly. We've both worked in restaurants.
Right.
That's pretty impressive.
Right. And then her co-author, Malena Watrous, she's written everything. She's written fiction. She wrote a novel, If You Follow Me. She's written articles. She's also worked on other cookbooks. Her first cookbook collaboration was My Mexico City Kitchen with Gabriela Camara. And Malena manages the Stanford Continuing Education program on writing. So she's got some serious chops as well.
Right. I know. So we get to talk a lot about writing, getting into some nitty gritty details in this episode. So with no further ado, let's get to it. Nichole and Malena, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, we're really excited to talk to you. But Nichole, we wanted to start with you for just a minute because you're the chef owner of a very busy bakery cafe in San Francisco. So when and why did you decide to write a cookbook?
Well, as a small business owner, it's not very often you get the desire to put more on your plate. There's plenty to see to in the daily trummarum of what's going on around here. There's always a fire to put out, as my husband says. But, I've had Canteen now, or my husband and I have had Canteen now for 5.5 years. And over that time, we've morphed with the times. We've been through a pandemic. We've done a lot of things. And we saw that we were coming to a point, or where I was coming to a point where I was, especially during the pandemic, there was a big surge in our pastry sales because everybody was kind of spoiling themselves and treating themselves while things were rough. And I really got into it and got into the making of the pastries. And really, it was an afterthought when we first opened, but then being more and more interested in it personally, and then also having a binder that was just bulging with recipes and things that were just, in my eyes, looking to be shared with others. Just too much information to be able to capitalize on it in any fashion, because it's limited what we can do. But I thought that we were able to share these recipes. It could give someone some great experiences at home.
Right. So it sounds like you always knew it was going to be focused on Scandinavian baking because you come from the savory side. You've worked in fine dining. This could have been a savory cookbook. It could have been a chef-driven cookbook. But it sounds like from the onset, you knew it was going to be focused on baking.
When I met with the publisher, we talked about what seems to hit home best with the people that we interact with on Instagram and so forth. And for me, it was basically one of two things. It was the sprouted rye bread that was kind of like a fundamental recipe that we started with before we even had the brick and mortar. And then it was the pastries. So it was kind of like I wanted to give people what they were looking for. And sure, we could have done on other things, and maybe the next book will be something else. But I think the third slot would have probably been our savory porridges that we do, but some other time.
Let's bring Malena into this conversation, because at what point did you decide or realize you needed a co-author? And then how did the two of you come together?
I think that was the thing that made me most reluctant about writing a book. It was just the commitment that it would require, and having plenty to see to on a daily basis. I wasn't sure if I would be able to meet deadlines. I can write a little bit. I can't write like Malena. It's just like for me to write what she writes seemingly quickly. I don't know how long it takes you, Malena, but it's, it struggles. I remember one time having to write an article for the New York Times, and I stressed so badly about it that I just couldn't. It took me, a week and a half to write 900 words, so it was just like, this is not, I've got to like surrender to the idea that I can't be, good at everything, and that the people who are good at it, they can help me out. And so I think the way that we were put together, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, Malena, but it was through my agent in New York. We were talking, I had gone over the idea for the book with her. And then she said, well, we have to find a co-author. And she named a few people. Kate, you were also one of those. We went from there. And then Malena had written a cookbook previously, and you have Norwegian roots, Malena, and so forth. And so you had said that you loved baking. And so it was like in many, many different ways, it seemed like a really good fit. And you had the time to do it.
Right. Malena, what drew you to the project?
So I liked the project right away as soon as I heard about it. I had post-pandemic, I moved back to the Bay Area where we had always lived previously, but my family had been in the Boston area for a couple of years, where the other work that I do is writing, fiction, and also teaching writing courses online. So my work life wasn't really interrupted by the pandemic, but in many ways, life was just so dull and two-dimensional, and static. So once the restrictions lifted and we moved back to the Bay Area, I felt like I was eager to do something again that was in person and using my hands and learning new skills. And so, I love cookbooks, and that hits all of those notes. And so I mentioned to the agent I'd worked with on a previous cookbook, like, hey, I'm back in the Bay Area, and if you happen to hear of anybody who's looking for a co-writer, let me know. Actually, I think I must have very serendipitously contacted her very close to the time when she was communicating with Nichole, because I was sort of shocked to get a message, just maybe a couple of weeks later saying, I have a project you might be interested in. And I still had no idea at that point, whether that would be the case or not. But as soon as she described Nichole and the fact that it was I love baking. That's like a real passion of mine. So, I went into San Francisco one day and met Nichole, and she was, completely delightful and interesting. And I also just want to chime in and say, Nichole's actually a very good writer. You're a really good writer. It's just, I think in terms of the speed, I think it's really hard for people to figure out sometimes if they're not used to this, and you're not like an ego-driven person who's always pushing your own story or your own voice out there. And I think like to just find like, how do you summarize your life into 6 pages? How do you like find the key story that like has a thesis in it about the book you want to do? Like when it comes time to like revising and writing sentences, like Nichole was so easy to work with because she really does write very well. But I think it was more about like being able to speedily find the material. And I really enjoy interviewing people and talking to them and being nosy and getting to like write down, kind of get in their head. So it was fun to work together from the start.
Yeah, it's interesting. I love that you said that, Malena, too. And because what I heard when Nichole was talking about that New York Times article, the stress of just how hard it was to write that article. Not, I'm sure it was a really good article, but it is given everything else. Okay, maybe, but given everything else, you're balancing. It's work balance. It's not just work-life balance. It's like how much could you put into it. So you're together from the beginning, really. Nichole, you're already talking to your publisher. Was there a proposal before Malena came on, or did Malena?
No, there wasn't. So what had happened was, it ends up being that I had a connection at 10 Speed Press. Someone who was working with the cookbooks there. It had been like in the cards the whole time that when I was ready, they were ready to do something with me. So it was funny. At one point, I went over to this person's house for dinner, and then their child said, "So when are we going to start on this canteen cookbook?" And I was like, "Oh gosh," and he said, "Whenever she's ready." And so that was, during the pandemic. And that was kind of like, okay, maybe this is the right thing. This feels pretty good about like, then I could kind of fathom the idea of putting something out there. And I felt like, having been established now at that point for some years, I felt like we had a stronger identity, or I knew what Canteen was, or what we were good at, or what was popular with people. And so I felt like I love the idea of this kind of like, you take like, it's almost like a snapshot or like a time capsule of a time where the things that come into this book, it's what we deem as like fun, inviting, what we want to expose other people to and so forth. So I just love this, like the physicality of it is that it's not just an idea. It's tangible. I can reflect on it. And 10 years from now, I can look back and be like, what was I thinking, doing that? Or, so it felt right at that time. But I hadn't gotten anything down on paper. I think by the time I was met up with Malena, I had done some essays for my agent where she had basically said like, come on, you got to get to the core of this. And like really quite, yeah, that's a whole other story. It's like, come on, you got to, what's the essence of this? And I was like, I remember one time I was like, I had tears coming down. I was like, it's just a love letter to this country I've lived in this region and so forth. And she was like, yeah, so much with a love letter. Like we need to know what she was just ice cold. And so I was like, I need help. I need someone to get these words out. And then Malena popped into my head and was there, and you dug it out, Malena.
Yeah, I was just laughing at the thought of like, who cares about a love letter?
And yet it's the subtitle is a love letter. So
right,
everybody cares.
Came through.
Right. A love letter to the baking of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. So I think that is a fantastic.
Somebody liked it.
Oh, it's a fantastic subtitle.
We've both worked with this agent, and she's a really great sounding board, but she's always sort of like the no man, so, like as in like you have an idea, and she's like, no, that's been done to death, But it's kind of good in a way as the first gate, because she's like the no man who is on your side. So like she's like, this is stupid. Okay, that one, like, finding like 1 out of 10 ideas that work.
Well, sometimes working with a known person is helpful, because if they say no and it is no, you're like, yeah, that's a bad idea. But if they say no and you're like, wait, no, yes, and you push against it, I've found that it can help you figure out what's really important.
Yeah, we fought for a lot of Nichole knew what she wanted to fight for.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. So then I want to hear about what came next. So you both meet in person, you really click. Malena, you already are excited about the subject. You want to get your hands in some dough and bake again and just have that kind of physical sort of, something that's like more real than, say, all the Zoom, all the stuff that pandemic forced upon most of us. And so then you had to write a proposal then together. Was that the first sort of test?
Nichole was talking to an editor who was interested. There was no sort of sure thing. The proposal did go to other editors as well in the beginning. So we knew there's a likely home for this if we do a great job with this proposal, but we still need to communicate the book and sell it to their whole house. So we had about a month to write a proposal.
That's fast.
It was fast. That entailed, for anyone who might not know, coming up with sort of a thesis-driven story to articulate, what the book was going to be about and who it was for, why this book now, why this was a good time for it. The research showed that people were still baking a lot and kind of the home baking craze hadn't abated, and also that there was a big interest in Scandinavia and Scandinavia baking at that time. And then we also had to choose a couple of recipes to include. So I did get my hands in some dough early on. And I remember it was the brown sugar focaccia recipe and the caramel cuts.
Nice.
So we kind of just set to work. Getting the essay part right took the longest, kind of batting it back and forth.
If I remember right, everything that I'd written for the agent or passed over to the agent was then given onto Malena, and Malena read through it and then took portions of it or reworked or rewrote or, started from scratch with other things and really helped give it shape.
One thing that also made it great to work with Nichole was that her husband had gifted her a cookbook writing course, which happened totally coincidentally to be run through the Stanford program that I work for, the Continuing Studies program with Tori Ritchie. But I think that gave you a really solid foundation in proposals and cookbooks and how to format a recipe. So, it's not like we're born knowing these things. So you came into this collaboration with a pretty solid, it's one thing to read cookbooks. You think you know more than you do. But when you start trying to write recipes, there's a lot of formatting and procedure and, in the proposal process too, that you really don't know until you've learned some stuff about it. So you already had that and your notes were really helpful. You had a good table of contents. I mean, we revised it and refined it and moved some chapters around, but you already had a sense of the shape of the book.
Mm-hmm. Some of our assignments within that class were to kind of go off the idea that you were working on a cookbook. For me, knowing that I wanted to go in that direction, it was really nice to be able to use that time constructively.
Right. And that's actually interesting because we had Tori Ritchie on the podcast to talk about voice, actually. And that's so interesting that you've taken her class, because I think ongoing education, no matter what stage you are in the writing and cookbook creation process, is so valuable. But I wanted to know, Nichole, is there anything you learned from that class that's really stayed with you through this whole process? There
are so many things. She always had an endless supply of examples of this is what we're focusing on today. And these are some examples of it. And it was always a broad spectrum of kind of thinking about it in the nuts and bolts of what makes a cookbook work or not work or, what's important. She has so much experience. So it was just great.
She joined us one day when we were working. She was interested to witness our collaboration. She doesn't live that far away. And we were working on the almond-filled semla buns. And she was just very curious to watch how we worked together. And then she sort of echoed something that our agent was also often saying, which was Nichole would say some throwaway comment oh, scrape the plastic wrap to get all the custard off. And she'd be like, put that in the book. I would waste those drops, And both she and our agent were always saying that, there's so many recipes available on the internet that when people really want a teaching experience from a cookbook, to put in as much sort of culinary education as you can, because they could find, a recipe for a bun online, but they can't necessarily get Nichole's expertise.
I love that you mentioned that recipe in particular, Malena, because there's a great essay that goes with that recipe about Helena and the origin of how you came to perfect that recipe. And that's the kind of thing that I think you tease out through. I don't know if that essay was in the book originally or did it come from talking to Malena, the two of you talking about the recipe, but I think those sort of extras really give this book a lot of texture and depth.
I think, anyone who works with me is going to have more writing in the book than they might
Not just head notes.
Yeah, I love to write the little essays. And, whenever I could, like Nichole had a good character or a story that she would talk about, I'd be thinking like, ooh, how could that be in there?
So tell us a little bit about how you work together. So you finish the proposal, 10 Speed wants to pick it up, you get an editor at 10 Speed, and then what happens?
I can't speak for Nichole, but for me, it was like the perfect work situation that would probably never be recreated. And Canteen is closed on Mondays. So we figured out, or we had our table of contents. We had a certain number of recipes. I knew from working on a previous collaboration that for me, at least, like in an ideal world, I like to watch the chef cook the dish and because people think they know everything they're going to tell you, or they think they have the tips. But anytime that I would just get it in note form, I would be the one who would have to be sort of like remaking it and supplying information when in fact they're the person that the reader or the home cook wants to learn from. I would just be like sort of figuring it out as I go and checking back with them. But that was a lot less efficient than being able to just be there, closely observe them, creating something, taking notes. So Nichole and I figured out a really nice schedule where we kind of broke the table of contents down where we could group things together that required similar ingredients or procedures and depending on the complexity of the recipe, work through, say, 3 to 5 things per Monday.
And how many hours would that take you?
It would take us the whole day. And I think when I counted it at the end, we did something like 25 Mondays. Cookies, for instance, where we would sort of get it and I could go home and make the other 2 because it was the exact same procedure. But anytime we were doing something, brand new to me and or complicated, like laminated doughs or filling buns or anything like that, I wanted to be able to watch her. We sort of tried to do one chapter at a time, but we moved around if it ever made sense because something similar was elsewhere. And also we tried to do it a bit seasonally. We tried to match with what ingredients were available to some extent.
You were working at Nichole's home, your home kitchen, or?
No, at the restaurant. And that was part of what was so much fun, too, for me at least. And it was just having this huge, well-appointed, organized restaurant kitchen to bake in once a week. I would help out sometimes with little tasks, but for the most part, Nichole was the main cooking person, baking person, while I was following her around with a pen and paper or my computer and trying to just carefully write down everything that she did, making adjustments when we adjusted the recipe. And then I would go home and try to create a draft of these recipes within the week for sure. So she had her binder of recipes at work and I created a binder for the cookbook that grew and that gave us a sense of progress as well, seeing the pages fill in.
That seemed like a very efficient process.
In the beginning, we started with the easier recipes. That would say we started with the cookies, just because we also had to get a format down for the way that we were going to work together. And okay, you do this and I do this, and then we're going to try this. And what do we do when we have a baked good and, feedback and so forth like that. So once we had that down pat, then we could approach the more challenging recipes.
Makes sense.
It seems like such an efficient way to work because sometimes people ask me, well, how I'm going to start a cookbook, what should I do? And I think what you both did was you broke it down. You're not doing the whole book in a week. You're doing chunks at a time. And if you can break it down, I need 3 to 5 recipes a week. Okay, then you can figure out how many weeks that'll take you. Then you can figure out, okay, if a recipe doesn't work in the testing process, we have time to revisit it, tweak it, talk about it together. So that way, a daunting project like writing a Scandinavian baking book, which I do think has that daunting project sort of feeling at the very beginning, all of a sudden seems, you see how you're going to get to the end.
Well, and I also love what you just said about starting with the recipes that you already knew were going to work and were going to be in the book. Let's get those. And then because at first you're trying to figure out how you work together. It makes so much sense. And I do want to, there's so much we could talk about, but I want to go back to that. You mentioned this in the proposal, but the organization of the book they're not sweets and savories. It's an interesting organization. There's, tea time, there's breakfast time, there's different. Was that the original organization or did you have to sort of wrestle that into place?
I can remember a few things clearly. Cookies always came first because that was the simplest point of entry. Yeah, because it's the easy thing to make. And holiday baking always kind of came last, I think, because that felt like the end of the year. It's the end of the book. I don't think breakfast was originally called breakfast. I remember there was a chapter that was kind of like other things that aren't like Nichole was very logically concerned about like, but you don't bake pancakes, you don't bake and the agent and I were both like, who cares? It doesn't matter. I can still go there. But we had to figure out a way. I mean, we just didn't feel like the reader was care. It wasn't that we didn't care about Nichole's opinion. I was just like, well, I don't think that people are going to be like needing everything to be in the exact same category. We got a little bit of pushback at the beginning about like, people aren't going to want a super long and complicated bread recipe. And it was like, what? That was like the cornerstone of Nichole's like original baking enterprise before she even opened Canteen. It was just like out of the question not to include bread. And it's not a very complicated bread recipe either. It's almost like a no need, like you do a few steps, you mix it up and it just takes care of itself. So that was always going to be there. Like, one of those no's that we were like, that's happening. I think the chapter on smørbrød was like that kind of evolved because we're like, well, the bread's going to be there. Therefore, let's also have some of these beautiful like sandwiches and toppings.
I can't imagine leaving that chapter out.
Me neither.
Yeah.
I think that came into focus a little bit later.
Yeah, I think it's also just because often we meet people who love the bread but don't really know how to do it or what to do with it or how to serve it. And it is a beautiful bread that can be eaten with both sweet and savory. You can put butter and honey on it. You can toast it. You can not. And it is something that you eat all the time if you live in Denmark. And so I think that chapter came about just as like a suggestion of if you want to do it in like a modern Scandinavian way, these are some good suggestions for you.
You love everything cookbooks, right? And we love making it for you. Here's your chance to help us keep it going. Go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There you'll find links to all our new great merch, including t-shirts, sweatshirts, even a hat, and our bookstore where we earn commission on every book you buy. You can also leave us a review wherever you listen to the show. Again, that's everythingcookbooks.com/support to find all the ways to show us the love. And thanks for listening.
We wanted to ask a little bit about the voice. We'll get into recipe testing too, but I wanted to just sort of back up and talk about the voice. Like, co-authorship happens a lot of different ways, and this is clearly Nichole's voice in this book. I don't know who this is a question for. I guess it's for Malena, really, but how do you write in Nichole's voice?
Well, this was an area where Nichole, for her humility, was really, really wonderfully collaborative and, at least 50% part of the writing process of making that happen, because I am a pretty fluid and quick writer and I like to listen to people and think, but I think I have a really good memory for narrative and story and can kind of like augment and structure somebody's rambling story and make it into something tighter. Well, I'm not saying you ramble, everybody does, but like on the page, people don't want to read the version that would come out orally. So you have to understand how to kind of hear the structure and find the apex of the story and all of that stuff. So that part I enjoy doing and it comes naturally. And I think in terms of you listen for the diction, the word choice that someone uses, the way that they speak about themselves, and you're trying to reproduce that. But especially in the beginning, it's never going to be perfect because you have your own voice in your head too. But Nichole was really, really good about reading and responding to and really carefully reading and line editing every draft that I showed her. So we'd go back and I can remember her saying like, she would be sort of apologetic, like, I would just never use that word. I'm like, great. Like, I'm not attached to it. It's your voice. Like it's so important, that she feel like this sounds like her. And I feel like you can, step in a second, but I feel like by the end, after the passes like back and forth, you hopefully did feel like it was your voice and your words, but it took, we probably sent this thing back and forth 10 times by the time it was finally done.
Between the two of you?
Yeah. Starting with the roughest drafts of me saying, does this look about right? Just sort of getting something tacked in place to the end where you're sort of like analyzing every single word and making sure that like, in terms of both, most importantly, probably the clarity of the directions and like that's all, but also in the head notes and in the stories, like that, of course, that everything actually happened that way, that these are the words she would use, that the emphasis was where she wanted it to be. Because, I'm trying to use words to recreate the experience of her living in Denmark, having children, working different jobs, stuff that she knows, infinite more than I do about. So checking both for voice and accuracy over and over until it feels like yours.
For me, it was an eye-opening experience because I had first sent those essays over to Malena and she had read them through and she was like, okay, in essence, I think this is what this is about. And it was like, again, me, big crybaby. You wrote like 4 sentences at the end where I was like bawling my eyes out. I was like, she understands what this is about. And I remember my husband was like, what's going on? I was like, she totally gets what this, like, why this is important to me, why this project is important, why I want to write this book, what my takeaways from living in Denmark were and all that. It was very touching. Malena is super talented when it comes to taking some of my ramblings and turning them into something that makes sense and is fun to read and meaningful and really give some insight and kind of mimicking me in that way, which I felt like took a lot off my shoulders, which was wonderful because that's what I needed, because I can do the cooking part, but it's that, the wholeness of that book of like getting that voice right. And also Malena never pushed back on any of the things that I said, well, that doesn't sound like me, or I wouldn't say that or anything. She's just like, okay, got it. Just noted. I didn't feel like I was stepping on her, but it was just like, I want to get this right. And so it was amazing to have that. I can only say good things about Malena and the whole thing about having a co-writer. And it's been an amazing experience.
And I'm hearing, not only did, Malena interpret your voice, but that you then read it over and over. It was back and forth. And that to me, because, Kate more than myself, but we both had co-authoring experiences, and you don't always get that. And being able to get that feedback, if you're the co-author, getting that feedback is so essential, because you can write your heart out, but if they don't say, hey, that doesn't sound like me, you're just going to keep going in that direction. And so be able to have that just as...
But it was funny because sometimes when we go back and forth on things, I would be like, wait, did I write that or did she write that? Like we kind
That's
of...
great.
Oh,
yeah,
that's great.
She really did get in my brain.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But that's what you want, I think, by the end of the process, is not to remember. It should just be one voice. So my role, as I see it in this, is to just sort of be a conduit and a channel to get your voice down. I felt really good about each essay or each headnote or each, direction by the end, because I knew you had carefully checked to make sure that this was like what you wanted it to be, and also like the most accurate representation of either your life or how you wanted someone at home to be kneading dough or whatever it was. You have to do that for yourself when you're writing your own thing. It's like you get your first pass and then you're constantly, reading over it, being like, is that the truest way I could say that? Is that the most efficient? Is that detail necessary? So, having another person involved is kind of ideal when the synergy between them is good, because they're just being able to do that for each other, because it can be actually really hard to do that for yourself, I think, even if you're a writer.
Right. I could see also, though, in a collaboration, it takes a lot of trust in the other person. Say, Nichole, if you hadn't had that trust early on, that Malena could get your story down to its essence and understood the direction you wanted to go, it would be hard to just recreate that or just even establish that, because you're going to have, that shitty first draft. That's going to be like, this is sort of not quite right. But it's that trust that you're going to get there in the end, because at the beginning, you're still trying to figure out the voice if you're writing by yourself, or if you're writing a collaboration, it's sort of even more challenging at the beginning because of that. You're establishing that trust as you're writing. So it sounds like early on, this was like a great meeting, because I know from past experiences, it doesn't always, work this way at the beginning or at the end even.
I remember feeling really nervous when I had to do just like the very first pass of the first essay for the proposal, about you and your whole life. And just like, I hope that she likes this.
It's nerve-wracking too. Yeah, on the co-author.
You hope that the person understands like this is a first draft, like it's gonna get, because if they aren't used to the writing process at all and they think like this is what we're sending off.
Yep. You'll get there. It takes a while sometimes.
Yeah. And I wanted to add that was also something that, because Malena had worked on another cookbook prior to us working together, she was able to say, okay, listen, this is what's going to happen. First we do this, then we do this, then we're going to do this, then they come back and say this and that kind of thing. So like having that kind of overview, because we weren't always informed of what the next step was or how far into it we were in the process. So that was really nice being able to hear like, okay, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect from the first attempt.
Because I would say to Nichole, like, I know you feel like we feel a little bit micromanaged. Once the book is happening, nobody's going to pay any attention to us ever for a year. And that was in fact true.
Yeah.
You know, getting the proposal through was hard. And then for the cookbook, we could have probably put in, you know, one of the things that was happening with her proposal was like the level of complexity. Like I said, there was the bread and then, you know, should there be Danishes? Well, Nichole strongly felt like in a cookbook about Danish pastry, the Danishes needed to be in there, but it is something that's kind of hard to do at home. So much, you know, conversation around that. But by the time we were doing the cookbook, we probably could have put in like the most complex Danishes in the world and nobody was looking or catching that, you know?
How did that editing go once the manuscript was submitted?
We would usually just agree on who's going to take a look at it first and then pass it on to the other one. So we would always both have our eyes on it and go through it. Near the end, they would say stuff like, you know, only be looking for something, you know, where you weren't allowed to actually do any kind of text changes or, you know, omit sentences or anything.
Right. It's already been indexed and all of that. Yeah.
When it came to copy edits, like what Molly was saying, the edits back and forth, copy edits probably take the longest time to go through because of all those details. Just on the nitty gritty, how did that work?
In a weird way, that was probably the hardest part of the process.
I agree.
Unexpectedly for me. In the previous collaboration that I did, the person that I worked with wasn't particularly interested in that part of the process. So like I just kind of handled it and it was done, not necessarily for the good of the book. Nichole was very invested to the good of the book because, you know, there is a lot of stuff that doesn't get caught. And in fact, you know, we're still like, oh, why did that happen? You know, like looking little things. You know, it's easy, especially in a baking book where there's so many details. And one of the challenges that we discovered in that part of the process that, you know, was a real brain tangler was that baking recipes repeat procedure a lot. So then how much do you want to say like the exact same verbiage over and over? And especially with things like tips. So we, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we had both an agent and Tori and different people saying, yeah, throw in like really handy tips. So we had these like neat tips, but you start to be like, oh my God, I can't bear to see that direction about chilling the bowl for whipped cream again. But it seems weird. What are you going to put it in like 3 out of the 8 recipes that have it? Like, how do you decide, you know, how many times you repeat? It's a whole paragraph. It's kind of a lot of text. I just felt like it became kind of a brain tangler about how to make these final decisions around where to include things.
Yeah, we can tell them how to whip cream in this first recipe. And then next time it happens, are we telling them to go back to that first recipe and look in that or whatever? And I think what it ended up being is we ended up creating a section that's called Baking Best Practices, where we hope that everybody's going to read it before they start any kind of baking from this book. But it's just like little tips that we didn't want to repeat in every single recipe, but are valid and useful in many of the recipes. And it just kind of gets your head in the game about like what's important, how do we work around this? You know, when we're talking about mixing batter or measuring dry goods or portioning out dough, I feel like I'm always still, you know, I've been working in the industry for many, many years, and I love those little shortcuts that enable me to get things done quicker. And so I would want somebody to share those things with me if I were in their kitchen. And so I'm hoping that some of these will be adopted for the home baker as well.
It is a challenge.
The editor was pointing out, like, well, people don't read a cookbook linearly. So just because early in the book in a cookie recipe, you tell people, hey, a great way to chop chocolate chunks is using a serrated knife, they haven't necessarily read that recipe when they get to like chopping chocolate for a bun later on. So, but it seems weird to point them back to like a cookie recipe to look for a tip. So there were just a lot of choices to be made at the end that felt complicated. But then it all worked out. But I think that was the trickiest part of the book. Getting it to the 95% there part was fun, and it wasn't effort. Of course, there was effort involved, but it felt pretty seamless. And then it was like that last 5 to 10% of like detail was the trickiest.
Yeah. Also, I think the most challenging time for me as well, to have to go through it again. And at the end, you just feel like you really don't want to look at it anymore. Don't feel like it still has that same freshness. And then you start doubting the actual material about like, is this even good? Like, what do we do? That kind of thing. Because you've looked at it so many times.
What you said at the beginning, you're making this concrete, tangible thing, and there's a certain amount of anxiety around finalizing it, because then it's going to be that. It's not like, making a certain cookie and it's not perfect that day. The next day you make it again. So I think many authors can relate to that.
And I think like to what you just said, I've worked on fiction novels. I work with like people working on, narrative books as well. Everybody feels that way when they're just like, oh my God, I'm revising a piece of shit. I don't want anyone to see this.
It's true. And I can read the same paragraph on different days and think one day it's great. And the other day I'm like, this is so bad. I want to delete the whole thing. So I guess that's just how it is. Yeah.
That one thing that we did at the last stage that it kind of would sometimes seem inefficient and bug me when we were doing it, but in the end I totally stand by it and think it was absolutely the right thing, was that when we had the final copy edits, and I think there must have been like maybe 3 rounds of that, Nichole would do the pass first using track changes to tell me what she wanted to change, and then I would go over and input her changes. And when we were doing that, there were times where I would think, why didn't you just make that change? But I think it was better because it gave me a chance to see what you wanted changed and to make sure, that we were using the right words and just to keep the voice seamless. Like it was kind of like an extra layer of protection. It added a little bit of time, but I think it was the right way to work.
Right.
And I think if there was something that we were in doubt about with those changes, we'd call each other and say like, where are we at with this? Because it's hard to do that with those comments in a PDF document. But it was good to have some conversations about like, all right, are we accepting this, or is this okay with us? Or,
I mean, one of the things I'm just remembering now in a PTSD like way is that the document, it had the editor, 2-copy editor, Nichole's and my track changes, and it was just so
my computer was like steaming or smoking.
Yeah. My computer was like angry. I don't know what it is that track changes does to the computer, but it's like the more people's input, the slower and more sluggish it gets. And so that I remember just being like, oh my, I can't even get to that recipe. But finally it was done.
Well, and now is it done? We talk about an object. It's beautiful, and we're running out of time. But we have to talk about the design of it and the ribbon. I mean, you got a ribbon. Yes.
Nichole, tell the story of the ribbon.
So if anyone doesn't know, the ribbon is a bookmark.
I'm so glad you're mentioning the ribbon, because the ribbon is really it was a hard won battle.
Okay, the ribbon story is that as a home baker, when I'm baking at home or making food at home, I love to have a bookmark. It's always, I don't have one of those things that you put up on your tabletop to hold your book open or anything like that. And I just think that it also adds such a nice little homey touch to a book, especially with a baking book. So for this particular book, we've got kind of these rough pages. It's not a glossy paged book. It's meant to be used and get dirty and all that kind of thing. So from the first stages, I had an idea that I would love to have a ribbon in the book. And I mentioned it to this contact that I had within 10 speed that I would love to have a ribbon. And then they said, well, yeah, that might be doable. So once I started with the real editor that was assigned to the book, I mentioned it to her that I would like to have a ribbon. And she said, oh, yeah, we'll figure it out. So I don't know when a ribbon needs to be part of the process, but
I don't know either, actually. Yeah.
We started talking about layout and design, and then at the one point they said, well, all right, I think the book's ready to ship out then. And it was like, wait a minute, what about the ribbon? So all of a sudden I wrote to my editor and said, we had a deal about a ribbon, And then she said, oh, I don't know about that. The book has really gotten to be more expensive than we thought. I don't think we have it in the budget. And I thought, yeah, but I know this other person told me that there was probably room for a ribbon. So she said, I don't know. So I talked to my agent in New York, and she said, you need to take that other guy out for lunch and then bring up the subject about the ribbon. So I quickly made a lunch date. We met for lunch, and then I, put that right on the table and said, I need a ribbon. You had talked about it, and he said, okay, let me figure that out. I'll get the right people on it. And so then the ribbon happened. And before I knew it, like within a day, I had color swatches to look at, and we thought it would be pretty to do the reddish color.
Oh my gosh.
I remember when you told another editor, she was like, oh, it might have to be dinner for a ribbon. It was like the price of the ribbon was going up. Yeah. Just lunch? I don't know.
Right. Nice bottle of, wine.
And the red to match the raspberry squares on the cover, you think?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've got
Oh gosh. It just explains so much about book publishing, the archaic sort of nature of it that you just don't know. But you had to speak up and you had to ask.
I actually had his his word on it from early on, which if I had not had that, I probably wouldn't have gotten my ribbon, which I don't know what I would have done at that point. But, there are also books that have 2 ribbons. So
you did ribbon research.
2, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have zero to do with, but that Nichole did such a good job with was, just lining up the perfect photography, I think, personally for the book. And I think it's so important. I hate baking books that don't have enough pictures. I don't want to make the thing if I can't see the picture. I don't know. It's just like, I feel like with baked goods, especially, you need a photo to understand what you're making. And I thought you picked just such beautiful photography to go with the recipes.
I mean, especially I think when you're doing a different cuisine that's a little lesser known, it can be hard where you're like, what does it even look like in the end, kind of a thing. And then, I just was very fond of a photographer in Copenhagen. I think he does such wonderful work. We actually went all the way to Copenhagen to get the photographs taken. So that was amazing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
If we want to talk about behind the scenes, from a budget perspective, it's kind of like, okay, well, I can go to Copenhagen. I know, I've lived there for so long. I know where to get things, where to source things, where I can shop, how I can do this, where I can live. There's no guesswork there. I could be flexible about my travel dates. I could figure that out. I could bring my stylist with me, pay for her ticket as well. And then we could meet over there and be completely focused where I wouldn't have to compete with the daily ongoings of what's going on in my restaurant. So I was able to completely dedicate my time to that. Whereas if I had done it the opposite way, you kind of have that power to make those decisions when you get that contract, is because you're the one that is kind of financing all these small things, these elements of the book process. So we could have flown the photographer here. We would have had to pay for a studio. We would have had to pay for his flight, his lodging, and I felt like then we're in the United States and maybe we don't have those things that are going to make those pans, all the different props that would make it feel really, truly Scandinavian. So in my opinion, I think even though it was an extremely hard 6 days that we had for photography, it was by far the best solution for us. Next time I'll take an assistant or 2 with me.
Wow.
I was sad not to go until I heard about like the 10 recipes a day that you guys had to bake over there.
Are those your hands in the process shots?
Oh, some of them.
Because that's a lot to do process too.
Right.
That's a lot to do process. And then also because you have something in a lot of these cases, you have something that has yeast in it. So it's like, there is just that window that you have to, and then because flour is different over there and there's just like all these little things. So it was super intense experience, but I'm really, really pleased with what we came out with.
Very cohesive looking. It all tells the story that you set out to tell from the beginning. So I do want to say congratulations to you, Nichole, to you, Malena, for finding such a successful partnership. You can tell it shows.
Thank you.
To wrap up, I wanted to know if each of you would just say maybe a couple of parting words for somebody who maybe is looking to do a cookbook collaboration or work with a team on a book.
One piece of advice I would give is it has meant a lot to me that I think that the success of our partnership has been partially due to the fact that Malena is interested in baking. She has Norwegian heritage, aside from being an excellent writer. there should be that genuine interest with whoever you're going to work with.
I also think, and I don't know how you can guarantee for this to happen, but I felt like fairly early in the process, we became friends. And that made everything better because working together was fun. I just felt a personal connection to Nichole as well as to the project. And it made it not feel like work. And I mean, though, of course, it is work. So I think if possible, just having a good rapport, I think is important. It's such a labor of love. And I think for both parties, it tends to be more work than you're making money for it. So you want to make sure you're getting some pleasure out of it. And also for me, I also just want to add another reason to do this work is just like your baking or your cooking game is vastly improved by getting to work with somebody like Nichole who knows so much.
Wise words. Well, thank you both. It's been a delight to talk and learn more about how Scandinavian baking came to be.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to support us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. This show is available wherever you get your audio, and if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.